from the moment Japan entered the Second World War in December 1941. Its army had never been stopped on land. Not in China, where it had been fighting since 1937. Not in Malaya, where it drove the British Empire down a peninsula in 70 days. Not at Singapore, where 130,000 Allied soldiers, including the entire Australian 8th Division, surrendered to a force of roughly half that size in what remains the largest capitulation in British military history. Not at Rabaul, not in the Philippines, not across the immense territory that fell to Japanese forces in less than 6 months of continuous advance. In 5 years of combat across Asia and the Pacific, no Allied land force had halted a Japanese offensive. The force that finally did it was not an elite division, not veterans fresh from the desert campaigns of North Africa, not any formation that Allied High Command would have deliberately selected for the task. It was a militia battalion from Victoria, composed primarily of 18-year-old boys armed with rifles from the First World War. Weapons that were, in some cases, literally older than the soldiers carrying them. Tell me in the comments, have you ever heard of the 39th Battalion before today? Because what you are about to learn will change the way you think about courage, about youth, and about what professional soldiers sometimes forget the untested are capable of. Now let us go. To understand how those boys came to be the last line of defense between Japan and Australia's survival in the Pacific War, you must first understand what Japan had become by the middle of 1942, and why the Allied High Command failed to fully calculate what was coming. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, and in the weeks that followed, launched a simultaneous assault across Southeast Asia and the Pacific that overwhelmed Allied defenses at a pace nobody had planned for. Malaya fell. Hong Kong fell. The Philippines fell. At Singapore, the fortress that British imperial planning had described for years as impregnable, 130,000 troops, including virtually the entire Australian 8th Division, were marched into captivity on the 15th of February, 1942, by a Japanese force that had traversed the Malay Peninsula in 70 days and was outnumbered by the garrison it was capturing. The fall of Singapore was not merely a military disaster. It was a psychological event that rewrote the assumptions of every nation involved in the Pacific War about what Japan was willing to do and how fast it could do it. On the 23rd of January, 1942, the lesson arrived directly on Australian territory. 20,000 Japanese troops overwhelmed the 1,400-strong Australian garrison at Rabaul on the island of New Britain, the first time in Australian history that Australian-administered territory had been formally invaded. The speed with which it was crushed confirmed that the war in the Pacific operated by different rules than anything the Australians had prepared for. Port Moresby, the capital of the Australian territory of Papua on the southern coast of New Guinea, was the forward base that underpinned the entire Allied position in the southwestern Pacific. Control of it meant control of the air over the Coral Sea. Queensland lay roughly 500 kilometers to the south, well within range of Japanese aircraft operating from a Moresby airfield. If Port Moresby fell, Australia would be fighting a defensive war on its own coastline, with no realistic prospect of American support reaching it in time to matter. Japan's initial plan was a seaborne assault on Port Moresby. In May of 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea stopped that convoy. Then in June, the Battle of Midway removed 4 Japanese fleet carriers from the order of battle in a single engagement. Japan turned to the only remaining option, an overland advance through the mountains of New Guinea. Japanese pre-war reconnaissance had suggested that a road suitable for motor transport crossed the Owen Stanley Range from the northern Papuan coast to the approaches to Port Moresby. There was no such road. What existed was a foot track that wound approximately 96 kilometers through mountains, rising to more than 2,000 meters above sea level. Into the space between those assumptions, the 39th Battalion was sent. The Kokoda Track was not a road. It was a foot track through one of the most hostile environments that human beings have chosen to conduct warfare in. Across 96 kilometers of the Owen Stanley Range, it ascended and descended continuously, with no flat ground, no level approach, no stretch where the gradient permitted rest. At the highest points, the elevation reached 2,190 meters. The jungle canopy was so dense that direct sunlight rarely reached the track's surface. Rain fell every afternoon and through most nights, turning the ground to mud in which men sank to their knees. At altitude, temperatures dropped toward freezing at night, while the humidity remained crushing through the days. In the moss forests near the highest peaks, the leeches were measurable in millions. Malaria was endemic. Dysentery moved through units like weather. Distances on the track were not measured in kilometers. They were measured in the days it took to cross them. Lieutenant Don Simonson of the 39th Battalion, from the temperate climate of Victoria, later recalled his first encounter with the track. We moved into a country that we had never dreamt of before. At the highest peaks there was moss forest and leeches by the millions. And although we were wearing leggings, they could somehow get in. Within a short distance, you would find a mass of blood around the bottom of your legs. Signalman Harvey Blundell summed up the conditions in a single word: terrible. The 39th Infantry Battalion had been formed in October of 1941 from Victorian militia volunteers. They arrived in Port Moresby in early January of 1942. For the months that followed, most of their time was spent not in combat training, but in physical labor, unloading ships, digging fortifications, performing the work that a garrison does when its commanders believe it will never actually be required to fight. Their average age was 18.5 years. The rifles they carried were Lee Enfields from the First World War, manufactured for a different conflict, on a different continent, against enemies who fought in open country rather than from the undergrowth of one of the densest jungles on Earth. Some of those weapons were more than 30 years old. Some had been in service since before the men now carrying them were born. They had no camouflage uniforms. They had no entrenching tools adequate for the ground they would be required to dig. They had no artillery. The professional soldiers of the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, who had fought in North Africa, in Greece, in Crete, had a name for the militia. They called them Chocos, short for chocolate soldiers. The implication, they would melt when exposed to heat. The men of the 39th heard this. They carried it with them into the mountains in July of 1942. When the orders came and the battalion shouldered its weapons and its packs and began the march toward whatever was coming down from the northern coast. The force moving toward them was the opposite of everything they were in, almost every measurable respect. Major General Tomitaro Horii was born on the 7th of November, 1890, in Hyogo Prefecture, Japan. He graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1911. He had served in China. He had commanded the South Seas Detachment since 1941, leading it in the capture of Guam in December of that year, and then leading the operation that destroyed the Australian garrison at Rabaul. He had never fought a battle he did not win. His troops carried that record with them. The core of the South Seas Detachment was the 144th Infantry Regiment, 3 battalions trained extensively in amphibious operations. The 41st Infantry Regiment reinforced them, veterans who had fought specifically against Australians in Malaya and Singapore. Men who had direct experience of Australian tactics and psychology in combat. They wore camouflage. They moved through jungle with the quiet efficiency of soldiers who had practiced doing exactly this across multiple previous theaters. Their standard daily ration was 3 cups of rice, supplemented by food taken from the villages they passed through. They had mountain artillery, mortars, and coordinated machine guns in quantities that nothing the 39th Battalion carried could match. These men had invaded 8 countries across 5 years without a significant defeat. The concept of being stopped on the ground had not featured in their operational history. The forward motion of their advance was reinforced by everything they had experienced since 1937. The consistent discovery that the enemy in front of them, however determined, eventually broke. Hori's plan contained a supply assumption that was catastrophically optimistic. Each of his soldiers began the march carrying 16 days of rations. The plan anticipated that the advance would be swift enough that captured Australian food and equipment would supplement what the men had carried in. What Hori did not calculate for was an enemy that would fight slowly, stubbornly, from position after position, refusing to break and run, consuming Japanese resources at a rate that the supply lines from the coast could not replace across that terrain. He had privately expressed doubts about the feasibility of the plan before the campaign began. He did not press his objection. In the early evening of the 21st of July, 1942, the first elements of Hori's force came ashore at Gona Mission on the northern Papuan coast. Initial landing: approximately 1,800 troops, with more convoys following. Engineers moved immediately to begin constructing a road toward Port Moresby. Infantry pushed inland without waiting for them. The pre-war maps had promised a route suitable for motor transport. What the advance parties found was the Kokoda Track. The road was never built. B Company of the 39th was commanded by a man his soldiers called Uncle Sam. Captain Sam Templeton had kept his company moving and confident over terrain that would have defeated men with twice the training. And his soldiers trusted him in the way that young men trust the kind of officer who goes where they go. When the Japanese made contact and the PIB patrols fell back and the track to Kokoda was cut, and the situation became one where a forward company commander needed more men and more ammunition and had neither, Templeton made the decision the moment required. On the 23rd of July, 1942, he turned back through Japanese lines toward battalion headquarters at Oivi to request the reinforcements that might still change the balance. He was never seen again. Whether he was killed in the attempt or captured in the hours after it was never established with certainty. His name was given, after the campaign, to 2 positions on the Kokoda Track: Templeton's Crossing 1 and Templeton's Crossing 2, permanent markers in the mountains of Papua for a captain whose exact death no witness survived to record and whose body was never found. With the track to Kokoda cut and the survivors of B Company facing encirclement in darkness, a lance corporal of the Papuan Infantry Battalion named Sanopa did something that does not appear in any easily available account of the campaign. He knew these mountains the way men know landscapes they have grown up in, not from maps, which were wrong in critical particulars, but from the kind of practical knowledge that cannot be acquired in the time available to any foreign soldier entering unfamiliar terrain for the first time. Sanopa led the Australians through the jungle by night, navigating around the Japanese positions, finding the route south to Daniki, where the rest of the battalion was concentrated. He brought men who were otherwise lost and encircled out of the closing net and into safety at a moment when the alternative was catastrophe. His name is not on any monument in Australia. At Daniki, the survivors joined Lieutenant Colonel William Owen and the remainder of B Company. Owen was 50 years old, a veteran of the fall of Rabaul, who understood precisely what he had. On the 27th of July, he moved back into the unoccupied village of Kokoda with 77 men, placed them in defensive positions on a spur line east of the runway, contacted Port Moresby by radio for reinforcements, and prepared to hold what he had. 2 Douglas transport aircraft arrived overhead, carrying the reinforcement companies he had requested. They circled the airfield. They assessed the approach as too uncertain, the perimeter too small to land safely. They turned south without landing. Owen and his 77 men watched them go and returned to their positions. The first assault came in the late afternoon of the 28th of July. Trumpets, shouting, a surge of Japanese infantry that the garrison repelled in brief and violent close quarters fighting. Under cover of darkness, the second assault came in quietly along the spur line. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Owen was in a forward fighting pit, grenade in his hand, rifle across his knees, walking the line as he had told Lieutenant Garland he would walk it, when a bullet struck him above the right eye. The battalion's medical officer, a 70-year-old doctor known to everyone on the track as Doc Vernon, performed surgery on Owen under a lamp inside a hut yards from the firefight, while the battle continued in the dark around them. Owen died. The order to withdraw was given. Kokoda fell. What the Australians did not know until captured Japanese documents were later examined was how the men who had just taken Kokoda assessed what they had defeated. The Japanese believed they had repelled a force of approximately 1,200 Australians. The actual number defending Kokoda had been 77. 77 men in improvised positions, their commanding officer dying on a surgery table in the dark, had inflicted sufficient casualties on Japan's elite infantry that those elite infantry counted them as 1,200. If boys fighting with every advantage stacked against them fought like 1,200, what would they become when the odds narrowed? The question was tested on the 8th of August, when the 39th counter-attacked with approximately 430 men and briefly recaptured Kokoda. A company accounted for roughly 180 Japanese dead. The airfield was within reach. The reinforcements and the ammunition that could be flown in from Port Moresby would change the mathematics if the aircraft could land. The aircraft circled, assessed the approach, and turned south again. By the third day, with ammunition depleting and no resupply arriving, the 39th abandoned Kokoda at Unbeaten for the second time and turned south toward the mountains. The airfield went back to Japan. It would remain Japanese for nearly 3 months. Command of the combined Australian force in Papua passed on the 24th of August, 1942, to Brigadier Arnold William Potts, born the 16th of September, 1896, in Western Australia. A grazier, a Gallipoli veteran who had fought in France before the war that was supposed to end all wars concluded without ending his service, and who had returned to uniform in 1942 with the experience that 2 generations of Australian warfare had deposited in the men who survived it. He had taken his brigade into the Blackall Range before deployment to Papua to practice in scrub terrain that approximated what they would find on the other side of the Coral Sea, at a time when no other Australian formation was doing this. He was the right man for the task he had just been assigned. What he would receive for executing it correctly becomes relevant later. 8 days before Potts assumed command, the man who would conduct the actual defense of Isarava arrived to take charge of the unit that would conduct it. Lieutenant Colonel Hyacinth Ralph Honor arrived at Isarava on the 16th of August, 1942. He was born on the 17th of August, 1904, in Fremantle, Western Australia. A school teacher, then a lawyer, who had met his wife Marjorie while they were both studying to become teachers and had been engaged to her for 9 years before they could afford the wedding. He had commanded C Company of the 211th Battalion in the Western Desert at Bardia, at Tobruk, at Derna. Then Greece, April 1941. Fighting from Kalabaka to the Bralos Pass to the sea. Evacuated to Crete. Defended the Redimo sector against German paratroopers for 10 days before the island surrendered. Escaped to Alexandria. Awarded the Military Cross for his leadership in the retreat. His commanding officer wrote of him that he was the best company commander he had known in this or the last war. Returned to Australia. Briefly reunited with Marjorie. Sent to Papua. What he found when he reached Isurava needed no elaborate briefing to understand. He described it himself. Worn out by strenuous fighting, exhausting movement, and weakened by lack of food, sleep, and shelter, many had literally come to a standstill. Practically every day, torrential rain fell all through the afternoon and night, cascading into their cheerless weapons pits and soaking the clothes they wore, the only ones they had. He noted that any determined Japanese assault at that moment would probably have overrun the battalion. The Japanese, who did not know this, did not immediately attack. The lull gave him something he had not been promised and could not count on continuing: time. The 53rd Battalion had arrived around the same time, sent forward to hold the Abuari side track east of Isurava. The 53rd came from the same pool of Victorian and New South Wales militia volunteers, raised in the same months under the same military structure, trained on the same program that had produced the 39th. Their performance in the coming battle would be widely criticized by Allied commanders. The difference between the 39th and the 53rd was not the men. Historians who have examined both units have consistently found that the variable was the officers, that the 39th's officers had drilled their men seriously, trained them with purpose, and built the kind of unit confidence that carries soldiers past the point where their legs and nerves have nothing left in them. The 53rd's officers had not done this. Same human material. Different outcomes under the same pressure. The Kokoda Track spent 3 months establishing that leadership is not an abstraction. In the intervals of the lull, the men of the 39th discovered what a small thing could mean after weeks of misery. Private Sid Halen, who had never acquired a taste for plain black tea, was given half a cup by a Salvation Army worker at Kokoda. No milk, no sugar. He wanted more, and there was none available. He never forgot that half cup. It is the most precise account available of what soldiers find themselves treasuring when everything they previously considered ordinary has been stripped away. On the 26th of August, the forward outposts of the 39th Battalion made contact with the Japanese advance. The lull was over. An assembly of approximately 2,500 Japanese soldiers moved forward from Deniki against the Isurava position, where the 39th Battalion held approximately 400 men. That same afternoon, the first 2 companies of the 214th Battalion arrived at Isurava after their march up from Maiola. Approximately 90 men, exhausted from the climb, stepping into a situation whose scale they had not yet assessed. Their arrival was intended as the beginning of a relief. Before the whole of the 214th could arrive, the battle the relief was meant to preempt had already begun. The 214th was not what the 39th was. These were AIF veterans who had served in the Western Desert, in Syria, in Lebanon. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Key, had served with the 208th Battalion at Libya, Greece, and Crete before transferring to the 214th in January of 1942. He was capable, experienced, and steady in the way that comes from having led men through difficult situations before. At the same time the battle at Isurava was beginning, something was happening 30 kilometers east. On the 25th of August, Japanese Marines had landed at Milne Bay at the eastern tip of Papua, a second prong of the assault on Port Moresby. The garrison at Milne Bay included 2 Australian brigades and P-40 Kitty Hawk fighter aircraft. By early September, the Japanese had been driven back to their ships in what became the first full-scale Japanese defeat in a land battle in the Pacific War. The resources Japan had committed to Milne Bay were resources that did not reinforce Hori at Isuravi. The margin by which Hori subsequently failed to destroy the Australian force completely would prove tighter than the raw numbers suggest. Hori's plan at Isurava was a double envelopment. The 1st Battalion of the 144th Regiment would pin the Australian centre with frontal assaults. The 2nd Battalion would drive east along the Eora Creek Gorge and attack the right flank. The 3rd Battalion would encircle the Australian left and cut the track behind them at Alola, completing the destruction of Maroubra force before it could withdraw. A 4th Battalion he held in reserve for the pursuit. He had applied this template successfully against British forces in Malaya and against Australians at Rabaul. On the 27th of August, heavy mountain gun and mortar fire opened the day before the infantry came forward. The Australians held in fighting that the Australian official history described in terms that formal military prose rarely employs. Through the widening breach poured another flood of the attackers, to swirl around the remainder of the right platoon from the rear. They were met with Bren gun and Tommy gun, with bayonet and grenade. But still they came, to close with the buffet of fist and boot and rifle butt, the steel of clashing helmets and of straining, strangling fingers. At the regimental aid post, something happened that does not appear in tactical histories of the battle, but that the men who were there carried with them for the rest of their lives. Word reached the aid post during the fighting on the 27th and 28th of August that the rear guard needed more men. Every soldier at the post who could still walk, who had been wounded, who was technically a patient waiting for evacuation, picked up his rifle and his kit and went back. Not ordered, chose it. On the 28th of August, Hori committed his 2 reserve battalions, an additional 1,200 men. He now commanded the equivalent of 6 infantry battalions against a combined force that numbered fewer than 1,000 men in total. Lieutenant Colonel Key assessed this arithmetic and advised Brigadier Potts that the Isarava position could not be held on the following day. One element of the calculation could not have been planned for. The 3rd Battalion of the 104th, the 1,200 men designated for the encircling movement around the Australian left, became completely lost in the jungle. It wandered far from the battle, unable to navigate accurately in dense terrain, without visual reference points. It did not emerge until the fighting was over. Its commander later reported, "At Isurava, we did not fire a shot or lose a man. 1,200 soldiers intended to complete the encirclement, swallowed by the mountain they were supposed to use as cover. The Australians held partly because of what they did, and partly because the terrain consumed a third of the force sent to destroy them. The following day came anyway. On the 29th of August, 1942, the Japanese attacked Isurava with the equivalent of 6 infantry battalions simultaneously. D Company of the 214th, in the center of the position, absorbed what was coming with a stubbornness that would later appear in the numbers. 11 separate Japanese assaults on their position across the morning and into the afternoon. 11 times the Japanese infantry came at them through the fire, and 11 times D Company sent them back. C Company of the 214th, holding the right flank, broke under the 12th. The Japanese poured through the gap with the force of men who have been pressing against a barrier and felt it give. The gap widened. The flow moved toward battalion headquarters at the top of the hill. If headquarters fell, the entire position collapsed from within. The moment required a counterattack immediately with whatever was available. What was available was the survivors of 9 platoon of the 214th Battalion, They had been overrun earlier in the same battle. Most of them were dead. Private Bruce Steele Kingsbury was 24 years old. He had been born on the 8th of January, 1918, in Armadale, in Melbourne. His father was a real estate agent. He had enlisted on the 16th of May, 1940, and served with the 214th in the Western Desert, in Syria, in Lebanon. He had been in continuous contact with the Japanese since the 27th of August. He was one of the few survivors of a platoon that had been overrun and severely reduced by the enemy. When the counterattack order came, Kingsbury was not assigned to it. He volunteered to join a different platoon's assault on the breach. He picked up his Bren gun and went into the gap. He rushed forward, firing from the hip, through concentrated machine gun fire, sweeping Japanese positions from left to right, advancing without stopping, clearing the path that the platoon behind him needed cleared. Eyewitnesses on both sides later said his actions physically halted the Japanese momentum. Not slowed it, stopped it. In the specific sense that a force in motion can be brought to a standstill by a single thing it did not expect and has not encountered before. He continued to advance, continuing to fire, continuing to clear. And then a sniper's bullet found him, and he fell. He was still going forward when he died. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the first awarded on what was then Australian soil, and the only one awarded for the entire Kokoda Track campaign. The counterattack restored the position, temporarily. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the perimeter had ceased to function as a perimeter. It had become a series of isolated positions with Japanese forces flowing through the spaces between them. By nightfall, Key had confirmed what he had told Potts the night before. Potts issued the order to pull back 2 kilometers south to Isarava Rest House. Breaking contact with an aggressive enemy pressing hard in difficult terrain at night is among the most hazardous operations infantry can be asked to execute. At Isarava, it was only partially successful. The force fragmented. Small groups found their own way south through the darkness, navigating by instinct and by the track beneath their feet toward the rendezvous at Alola. When the 214th mustered at Alola the following morning, 172 personnel were unaccounted for beyond those already confirmed dead or wounded. Most would find their way back across the following week. One officer would not. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Key had been cut off during the withdrawal. He was captured by the Japanese, taken back to a forward base, interrogated, and executed on or around the 10th of September, 1942. His name appears on the Port Moresby Memorial at Bomana among the missing, those without a known grave on a track that consumed too many of the men it carried. The week of fighting at Isarava, from the 25th to the 31st of August, cost the Australians 99 killed and 111 wounded. It cost the Japanese 140 killed and 231 wounded. Against an attacking force that outnumbered the defenders by more than 5 to 1, with artillery and mortars that the defenders could not answer with anything they carried. The casualty exchange did not favor the side with 6 battalions. Hori had taken the position. He had not destroyed the force defending it. From the 31st of August to the 5th of September, 1942, the Australians conducted one of the most sustained fighting withdrawals in Australian military history, through terrain that would have been difficult to traverse as a peaceful walk, and was conducted instead under fire, under pursuit, under the accumulated weight of weeks of continuous combat. Eora Creek, 30th of August. Templeton's Crossing, 2nd of September. Ifogi, 5th of September. At each place, the Australians turned and fought and delayed and withdrew before encirclement became complete. The Japanese followed hard. Every man was sick with malaria or dysentery or both. On the 5th of September, the 39th Battalion was finally relieved at Afogi and ordered to make its way back to Port Moresby. Of the 1,500 men who had arrived in Papua in January of 1942, 185 were fit for duty when the relief order came. Not wounded, not sick, fit. The other 1,315 were dead, missing, hospitalized, or no longer capable of sustained operations. On the 6th of September, at Manari village, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor addressed the survivors. He had known most of them for 3 weeks. He had commanded them through Isarava and Eora Creek and Templeton's Crossing and every position between. He spoke without notes. Now I do not know a lot of you by name, but I know you. We met at Isarava. We fought there together and every step of the way here. Now we are relieved and we will leave the battle. The battle we fought for the track may have just saved your nation. I want you to know that you are some of the finest soldiers that I have ever seen. You have seen things in this place that no man should witness. Some of these things you must forget, but history will remember you, and in the years to come, others will wish that they had your conviction. He closed, I am honored to be your brother. The Australian Army uses footage of that address today to teach values to new recruits at Kapuka. The words of a lieutenant colonel to exhausted men on a jungle track in September of 1942 have become foundational material for the institution they helped define. While the 39th were making their way back down the southern track, the Japanese were reaching the furthest point of their advance. On the 16th of September, the lead elements of the South Seas Detachment stood on Yoribaiwa Ridge, 32 kilometers from Port Moresby. On a clear night, Japanese soldiers could see the lights of the city below them. They had crossed the Owen Stanleys. They had pushed the Australians from every position they had defended. They were close enough to see what they had come from Gona to take. What the men on Yoribaiwa Ridge could not know was that the orders to stop their advance had already been issued. Imperial General Headquarters, watching the fighting on Guadalcanal consume resources that Japan could not afford to split between 2 theaters simultaneously, ordered the withdrawal on the 26th of September. Some of Hori's commanders required direct confirmation from Tokyo before they believed it. The confirmation came. The withdrawal began. Japanese war correspondent Seizo Okada reported what he witnessed in the hours after the order reached the men. For a time, the soldiers remained stupefied among the rocks on the mountainside. Then they began to move, and once in retreat, they fled for dear life. Discipline was completely forgotten. These were the soldiers who had seemed unstoppable at Isarava. On the 23rd of November, 1942, Tomitaro Hori attempted to navigate the Kumusi River on an improvised raft with his staff, impatient to rejoin the remnants of his force at the coast. The raft became stuck on a submerged tree. He and his chief of staff transferred to a canoe. The canoe capsized. Hori drowned. His body was never recovered. The general who had stood on Yoribaiwa Ridge and seen the lights of Port Moresby below him lies somewhere in the current of a river in New Guinea. The men who had stopped Japan came down out of the Owen Stanley Range in October of 1942 to find that the men who had sent them up were waiting with an account of what they had done that bore little resemblance to what they had actually done. General MacArthur was under pressure from the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, who described the Papua situation in October as critical. Prime Minister John Curtin had been direct in his guidance to General Sir Thomas Blamey. Moresby is going to fall. Send Blamey up there and let him fall with it. Blamey arrived in New Guinea, fighting for his own professional survival at the same time the men under his command were fighting for the survival of the continent. And the pressure from above required that the chain of command below him be held accountable for a withdrawal that the circumstances had made inevitable. He relieved Lieutenant General Rowell. He relieved Major General Allen 5 days later. On the 22nd of October, he relieved Brigadier Arnold Potts, the man whose fighting withdrawal down the Kokoda Track the historian Peter Brune would later describe as one of the most critical triumphs in Australian military history, and one that an apathetic nation has still to honor. Potts was told he was no longer required in New Guinea. He was denied the ability to address his brigade before he left. He was denied the ability to brief his replacement. He was sent to Darwin to train militia units. His staff captain Ken Murdoch was inundated with resignation papers from the officers of the 21st Brigade, who wanted the record to show what they thought of what had been done to their commander. Potts instructed Murdoch to reject all of them. In a letter to his wife, written in the aftermath, Potts swore to fry his soul in the afterlife. He was not referring to anyone in the Japanese command. On the 9th of November, Blamey visited those survivors at Koitaki camp near Port Moresby, the men who had held Isurava for 4 days against 6 battalion equivalents, who had turned and fought at Eora Creek in Templeton's Crossing and Afogi, who had finally checked the Japanese advance at Imita Ridge. They had assembled on a parade ground, expecting to be thanked. Blamey told them they had been beaten by inferior forces. He told them no soldier should be afraid to die. Then, remember, it is the rabbit who runs who gets shot, not the man holding the gun. The wave of restlessness that moved through the formation was immediate. Many later said Blamey was fortunate to leave the parade ground safely. During the march past that followed, many soldiers disobeyed the Eye's right order. When Blamey subsequently visited the camp hospital, wounded men nibbled lettuce and whispered the chorus of a popular wartime song, "Run, Rabbit, Run," as he passed between the beds. Honor went to see Blamey afterward. His account of the meeting: Blamey did not know who he was. He did not know who I was. I had been his commander of the Australian forces opposing the Japs. He did not know. He did not care. The Japanese who had fought these men were, at that same moment, staggering back across the mountains in conditions that had destroyed the army that crossed them going the other direction. Starving, riddled with dysentery. Some evidence from the period points to cannibalism among the most desperate. The soldiers who had been called unstoppable, the veterans of invasions stretching from Manchuria to the Coral Sea, had been stopped by teenagers with antique rifles and then beaten back by the reinforcements who arrived too late to spare those teenagers the full cost of slowing the advance alone. The chocolates had not melted. The men who called them chocolates had not been there to see it. The surviving men of the 39th did not go home after Kokoda. Reinforced with 800 new soldiers in Port Moresby, they returned to the fighting at Sanananda, at Buna, at Gona, and fought until the Japanese northern beachheads were finally destroyed in January of 1943. The battalion was disbanded shortly after, its personnel redistributed to reinforce other formations. Honor, who had commanded it through Isurava and Gona and everything between, took the disbandment hard. He was given command of the 214th Battalion 6 days later. He was shot leading a reconnaissance on the 4th of October, 1943. He never returned to active service. The only Victoria Cross awarded for the entire campaign was Kingsbury's. The sergeant who recommended him for the award was asked repeatedly to write the citation with more dramatic language. He declined. What happened on the 29th of August in the gap in the Isurava perimeter required no embellishment. Kingsbury's section became, across the remaining years of the war, the most highly decorated section in the British Empire. 1 Victoria Cross, 1 Distinguished Conduct Medal, and 4 military medals. His platoon sustained the highest proportional losses of any unit in the campaign. The two facts are not unrelated. The 39th Battalion is the only unit to have Kokoda listed as one of its battle honors. The unit that holds this honor no longer exists. It was disbanded on the 3rd of July, 1943. Its personnel redistributed to reinforce other formations, its history deposited in the records of the Australian War Memorial and in the mountain where it was made. The Papuan carriers who made the evacuation of wounded soldiers possible, who carried stretchers over terrain where no wheeled vehicle could move, and tended to their patients through the cold mountain nights with an immediacy and care that left Australian soldiers unable to find words adequate to describe the debt, were conscripted. Not all of them willingly, under the Employment of Natives order issued in June of 1942. They received no military pension until the 1980s. An estimated 16,000 Papuans worked as carriers during the campaign. The last of them, Havala Laula, died on the 24th of December, 2017. Australia began awarding commemorative medallions to living Papuan participants in 2009. Veterans widely called the recognition too little, arriving too late. The Isarava Battle Memorial was completed in 2002 on the ridgeline, where the 39th Battalion had dug their defensive positions 60 years before. 4 granite stones were placed there. Each one carries a single word: courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice. They do not name anyone. They do not need to. At Ralph Honnor's funeral in May of 1994, a Japanese veteran approached the coffin. He had fought against Honor on the Kokoda Track in 1942. He bowed. He bowed again. He offered a letter of condolence to the family. The man who had commanded the defense of Isarava received, across 50 years in the full width of the Pacific War, a gesture of formal respect from the man whose advance he had stopped. It is the kind of acknowledgement that institutional records do not accommodate. It happened anyway. Japan had never been stopped on land. Not in China, not in Malaya, not at Singapore, not across any of the territory consumed in the first 6 months of the Pacific War. The force that finally stopped it was not what Japan had been preparing to face. It was teenagers from Victoria with the weapons of a previous generation, committed to the track without adequate force, without adequate resupply, without any serious official reckoning of what they were being sent into, by a command structure that had made other calculations and discovered them to be wrong. At a cost it preferred to attribute to the soldiers who bore it. Bruce Kingsbury never came home to Melbourne. Sam Templeton never came home at all. William Owen never came home to his wife Daisy, who received his posthumous decoration at an American hospital in Melbourne with no husband beside her. The distance between the quality of those soldiers and the quality of the decisions that placed them on the track is the distance in which the real history of the Kokoda campaign is written. Their battalion was disbanded in Queensland in the winter of 1943. Its men dispersed, its name preserved in a battle honor no other unit holds, and in 4 words on a ridge in Papua New Guinea where, if you go there now and stand on the ground where they stood, you can understand without being told what those words were chosen to mean. If you believe those men deserve to be remembered for more than 4 words, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand how the Second World War was nearly lost before it was won, watch this next.